The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Mason Reed's corner office, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk where he sat reviewing quarterly reports. At 42, Mason had built Horizon Enterprises from the ground up, transforming it from a small tech startup into one of Boston's most successful companies. His sharp business acumen had earned him respect in the corporate world, but the same dedication that built his empire had cost him his marriage. 6 months ago, his divorce from Victoria had been finalized after 15 years together, a separation that left him with an emptiness that success couldn't fill. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, glancing up to see Abigail Parker, one of the company's accounting assistants, enter with a stack of folders clutched to her chest. "The financial projections you requested, Mr. Reed," she said softly, placing them on his desk. Mason nodded, noticing how she avoided meeting his gaze. There was something different about Abigail today, a pallor to her normally rosy cheeks, a slight tremble in her hands. At 27, she was relatively new to the company, having joined Horizon just over a year ago. She had quickly proven herself as diligent and intelligent, qualities that had caught his attention even before their paths crossed in a more personal way. "Thank you, Abigail," he said, deliberately using her full name instead of Abby, the nickname he'd called her during their brief but intense relationship 3 months ago, a relationship that had begun during a late-night working session and ended abruptly when she'd withdrawn without explanation. She turned to leave, but something made Mason call out, "Wait. Is everything all right? You seem unwell." Abigail paused, her back still turned to him. "I'm fine, Mr. Reed, just a little tired." He stood, concern etched across his features. "You've been just tired for weeks now. If there's something wrong—" "There's nothing wrong," she interrupted, finally turning to face him. For a brief moment, Mason thought he saw tears glistening in her hazel eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. "I need to get back to work." As Abigail hurried from his office, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Their relationship, though brief, had been meaningful, at least to him. After his divorce, he'd found in Abigail a warmth and genuineness that had been missing from his marriage for years. Her sudden withdrawal had left him confused and hurt, but professional boundaries and pride had prevented him from pursuing the matter. Across the building, Abigail locked herself in a bathroom stall, one hand pressed against her mouth to stifle her sobs, the other resting protectively on her still flat stomach. At 12 weeks pregnant, the morning sickness had become nearly unbearable. But it wasn't the physical discomfort that brought tears to her eyes. It was the impossible situation she found herself in. The memory of Victoria Reed's unexpected visit to her tiny apartment 2 weeks ago still sent chills down her spine. How the elegant woman had discovered her address, Abigail didn't know, but the threat had been crystal clear. Deny any connection between Mason and the baby, or watch as her ailing mother lost the healthcare support Abigail struggled to provide. "I still have friends on the board," Victoria had said, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the teacup Abigail had offered out of politeness. "One word from me about certain improprieties, and your position at Horizon becomes untenable. Without that job and its health insurance, what would happen to your mother?" The question had hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Abigail's mother, suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease, relied entirely on the treatment covered by Abigail's employee benefits. Without it, the cost would be catastrophic for someone living paycheck to paycheck, as Abigail did. "He doesn't need another distraction," Victoria had continued, her voice deceptively gentle. "Mason has always been ambitious. A child, especially one with someone like you, would only complicate the future I know he still wants." "Someone like me," Abigail had repeated quietly. Victoria's smile hadn't reached her eyes. "Don't take it personally, dear. You're just not part of the world he belongs to. I'm actually doing you a favor. Mason doesn't want to be tied down to a family. Why do you think our marriage ended?" Now wiping her tears in the company bathroom, Abigail wondered if there was any truth to Victoria's words. Had she misinterpreted Mason's interest in her? Had it merely been a post-divorce distraction? The few precious weeks they'd spent together had seemed genuine, with quiet dinners at her modest apartment, where they'd talked for hours about everything from literature to their dreams. Checking her watch, Abigail realized she was late for her doctor's appointment. She had scheduled it during her lunch break, hoping to slip out unnoticed. As she gathered her belongings and headed for the elevator, she didn't notice Diane, one of the company's cleaning staff, watching her with curious eyes. Diane had been emptying trash bins near the executive offices 2 months ago when she'd overheard a heated conversation between Mason and Victoria, the former Mrs. Reed had been demanding changes to their financial settlement, and in her anger had mentioned knowing about his little fling with the accountant. This juicy piece of gossip had been too good not to share with her cousin, who happened to be Victoria's personal assistant. At the medical center, Abigail stared in wonder at the ultrasound screen, tears flowing freely now as the technician pointed out the tiny form of her baby. "Everything looks perfect," the technician said warmly, printing several images. 12 weeks and 2 days, right on track with your dates. Abigail nodded, torn between joy at seeing her child for the first time and despair at the thought of facing this journey alone. As the eldest daughter of a single mother herself, she was no stranger to hardship, but the thought of her child growing up without knowing their father broke her heart. Back at Horizon, Mason was distracted throughout his afternoon meetings, his thoughts continually drifting to Abigail's pale face and the distance she'd maintained these past weeks. As the last meeting concluded, he decided to speak with her directly, personal and professional boundaries be damned. He found her cubicle empty, her computer shut down for the day, though it was only 4 o'clock. Glancing around, he noticed her co-worker Jessica packing up her own belongings. "Looking for Abby?" Jessica asked, then caught herself. "I mean, Ms. Parker, she had a doctor's appointment. Mentioned she might not be back today." Mason frowned. "Is she ill?" Jessica hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't think it's my place to say anything. Jessica, if there's something wrong with one of my employees, I need to know. She's just been having some morning sickness, that's all," Jessica replied, then immediately looked horrified at what she'd revealed. "I shouldn't have said that. Please don't tell her I told you." Mason stood frozen, the implications of Jessica's words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Morning sickness. Abigail was pregnant. The timing, her sudden withdrawal, her paleness, it all made terrible sense. But why hadn't she told him? Was the child not his? Or worse, had she decided he wasn't worthy of being a father? As Mason walked back to his office in a daze, one question burned in his mind. What was Abigail hiding? And why? The following morning, Mason arrived at the office earlier than usual, his night having been consumed by thoughts of Abigail and the revelation of her pregnancy. He had barely slept, his mind racing through calculations and possibilities. If Jessica's inadvertent disclosure was accurate, and if the timing aligned with their relationship, there was a strong possibility that Abigail was carrying his child. The thought simultaneously terrified and exhilarated him. Though his marriage to Victoria had dissolved, children had always been part of the future he'd imagined. Victoria had postponed the idea year after year, always finding reasons why the timing wasn't right. Her career in interior design was taking off. They should travel more before settling down. The market was too unstable. Eventually, Mason had realized that not now really meant not ever, and it had become one of the irreconcilable differences that led to their separation. But now, the prospect of fatherhood loomed unexpectedly before him. Why would Abigail keep such life-changing news to herself? The question gnawed at him as he reviewed the personnel files he'd pulled from human resources under the pretense of a routine review. Abigail's file was modest, but impressive. Graduated with honors in accounting from a state university, supporting herself through school with multiple jobs. Previous employment at small firms with excellent references. Emergency contact. Eleanor Parker, mother, residing in a small apartment in Dorchester. A note about Eleanor's medical condition was included in the healthcare documentation. Parkinson's disease, diagnosed 5 years ago. Mason leaned back in his chair, considering this new piece of information. Medical bills for a condition like Parkinson's would be substantial. Was financial pressure behind Abigail's silence? Was she afraid of losing her job due to their brief relationship? Corporate policy discouraged, but didn't explicitly forbid relationships between employees of different ranks, provided they were disclosed to HR. Still, he could understand her hesitation. Office gossip could be merciless. His intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Reed, the marketing team is ready for you in conference room B," his assistant reminded him. "Thank you, Kate. I'll be right there." He closed Abigail's file and tucked it into his desk drawer, resolving to speak with her directly after the meeting. When Mason entered the conference room, his eyes immediately found Abigail sitting quietly at the far end of the table. As the accounting liaison to the marketing department, her presence wasn't unusual, but seeing her now, with the knowledge he possessed, made his heart race. He noticed she wore a looser blouse than usual, one that concealed any subtle changes to her figure. Throughout the meeting, Mason struggled to focus on the marketing presentation. He caught Abigail stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking, her expression a mixture of longing and distress. When their eyes briefly met, she quickly looked away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. As the meeting concluded, Mason made his move. "Ms. Parker, could you stay behind for a moment? I'd like to discuss the financial projections for the new product line." The other team members filed out, leaving them alone in the conference room. Abigail remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Abigail," Mason began, deliberately softening his tone as he took a seat beside her, "I think we need to talk about something more important than marketing budgets." She looked up, wariness evident in her expression. "Mr. Reed, Mason," he corrected gently, "at least when we're alone. I think we've shared enough that first names are appropriate." A sad smile flickered across her face. "It's better if we maintain professional boundaries. Is that why you haven't told me about the baby?" The color drained from Abigail's face. Her lips parted in shock, and for a moment Mason thought she might faint. "How did you—" "It doesn't matter how I know," he said, fighting the urge to take her trembling hands in his. "What matters is why you felt you couldn't tell me. Is the baby mine, Abigail?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Abigail's eyes filled with tears, but before she could respond, the conference room door swung open. Victoria Reed stood in the doorway, as immaculately dressed as ever in a designer suit that emphasized her slender figure. Her gaze moved from Mason to Abigail with calculated precision. "Interrupting something?" she asked, her voice honey-sweet with underlying venom. Mason stood, instinctively positioning himself between Victoria and Abigail. "Victoria, this is unexpected. My assistant didn't mention you were coming by." "That's because I didn't make an appointment," Victoria replied, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "Some matters are too urgent for scheduling, like protecting your interests, for instance." Abigail had risen to her feet as well, gathering her papers with shaking hands. "I should go," she murmured. "No, stay," Victoria insisted, her smile not reaching her eyes. "This concerns you too, Miss Parker. Or should I say, the mother of my ex-husband's supposed child." Mason's head snapped toward Victoria. "How do you know about that?" "Boston is smaller than you think, especially in certain circles," Victoria replied dismissively. "But that's not important. What's important is that you're being manipulated, Mason. It's an old trick, isn't it? A convenient pregnancy right when the divorce settlement is being finalized." "Our divorce was finalized months ago," Mason said coldly, "and Abigail has made no claims or demands." "Not yet," Victoria countered, "but it's only a matter of time, though perhaps Ms. Parker would like to tell you herself what she told me when I visited her apartment." Mason turned to Abigail, who had gone deathly pale. "You went to her home?" he asked Victoria, disbelief coloring his voice. "I was looking out for your interests," Victoria replied smoothly. "Someone had to. Go ahead, Ms. Parker. Tell him what you told me about the baby." Abigail looked trapped, her gaze darting between Mason and Victoria. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. "Tell him," Victoria pressed, her voice hardening. "It's not yours," Abigail finally whispered, the words seeming to physically pain her. "The baby isn't yours, Mason." Mason felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath him. "What? There was someone else," Abigail continued, unable to meet his eyes. "Before you. The timing. It's not possible for the baby to be yours." Victoria's triumphant smile made Mason's stomach turn. "There you have it," she said, another gold digger exposed. "Really, Mason, you should be more careful about who you bring into your bed." "That's enough, Victoria," Mason snapped, his mind racing to reconcile Abigail's claim with what his instincts were telling him. Something didn't add up. The Abigail he knew, honest, principled Abigail, wouldn't lie about something so fundamental, and yet she'd just denied any possibility that the child was his. "I think I've done you a favor," Victoria replied, unperturbed by his anger. Now can we discuss the amendments to our property agreement? The penthouse in Back Bay specifically. Get out, Mason said quietly, his eyes never leaving Abigail's face. Victoria blinked, clearly not expecting this reaction. Excuse me. I said get out. Whatever business you think we have can go through our lawyers, and if I find out you've been harassing my employees, there will be consequences. Victoria's composure slipped momentarily, revealing the anger beneath her polished exterior. She glanced at Abigail with undisguised contempt before turning on her heel. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you when she comes after your money later. The door closed behind Victoria with a decisive click, leaving Mason and Abigail alone once more. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Is it true? Mason finally asked, his voice rough with emotion. Is there someone else? Abigail wrapped her arms around herself protectively. You should get back to work, Mr. Reed. The quarterly review is tomorrow, and you'll need the updated figures from my department. Damn the figures, Mason said, stepping closer. Look me in the eye and tell me the truth, Abigail. No Victoria, no company politics, just you and me and the truth. For a moment something flickered in Abigail's eyes, a longing, a desperation to confide in him. Then, like a shutter falling, her expression closed off. The truth is that this baby isn't your concern, she said flatly, and I'd appreciate it if you would respect my privacy going forward. Before Mason could respond, Abigail gathered her remaining papers and hurried from the room, leaving him alone with his doubts and a growing suspicion that there was far more to this situation than Abigail was willing to reveal. 3 days passed with Abigail successfully avoiding any private encounters with Mason. She strategically attended only the largest meetings, where his attention would be divided among many, arrived early to leave documents on his desk before he came in, and delegated any direct interactions to her colleagues. It was exhausting maintaining this careful dance, especially as her pregnancy symptoms intensified, but she reminded herself daily of what was at stake: her mother's health and well-being. Eleanor Parker had raised Abigail and her younger sister alone after their father abandoned the family when Abigail was just 7. Despite working multiple jobs, Eleanor had never complained, pouring every ounce of her energy into giving her daughters opportunities she never had. When Parkinson's disease had struck 5 years ago, forcing Eleanor into early retirement from her position as a school librarian, it had been Abigail's turn to become the provider and protector. Now, as Abigail entered her mother's modest apartment on Friday evening, the weight of her deception pressed heavily upon her shoulders. "There's my girl," Eleanor called from her favorite armchair, her voice warm despite the slight tremor that punctuated her words. At 63, Eleanor's once dark hair had turned completely silver, and the disease had bent her slender frame, but her eyes remained bright and perceptive. "You look tired, sweetheart." Abigail leaned down to kiss her mother's cheek, setting a bag of groceries on the small kitchen counter. "Just a busy week at work. The quarterly reviews always ramp up the pressure." Eleanor studied her daughter with the kind of attention that had always made Abigail feel transparent. "And how's the little one treating you? Morning sickness still bad?" Abigail had told her mother about the pregnancy 2 weeks ago, unable to keep such news from the person she trusted most. She hadn't shared the complications surrounding the baby's father, however, presenting it instead as the result of a relationship that had simply not worked out. "Better some days than others," Abigail answered, busying herself with unpacking the groceries. "The doctor says it should ease up soon as I enter the 2nd trimester." "And the father?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Have you reconsidered telling him?" Abigail's hand stilled on a can of soup. "Mom, we've talked about this. He's not in a position to be involved right now. Everyone deserves to know about their child, Abby. Your father may have been a disappointment, but not all men." "This isn't about Dad," Abigail interrupted, more sharply than she intended. Softening her tone, she added, "I'm sorry, it's complicated. Please trust that I'm doing what's best for everyone." Eleanor reached for her daughter's hand, her grip surprisingly strong, despite the tremors. "I trust you, darling. I just worry. This isn't the kind of burden you should carry alone." If only you knew, Abigail thought, forcing a reassuring smile. The burden wasn't just the pregnancy, but the web of lies she'd been forced to spin, lies that grew more tangled with each passing day. Across town, in his penthouse overlooking the Boston skyline, Mason sat in his home office, surrounded by paperwork, not the company reports he should have been reviewing, but printouts of his and Abigail's text message history, calendar entries from the period of their relationship, and notes he'd made about their time together. Something about Abigail's denial didn't sit right with him. He recalled their first intimate encounter, a night in early April when they'd worked late preparing for a board presentation. She'd mentioned then that she'd been single for over a year, focused on her career and caring for her mother. Their relationship had developed organically over the following weeks, quiet dinners, meaningful conversations, a connection that had felt genuine despite its brevity. Mason checked the calendar again. Their relationship had begun in early April and continued until mid-May when Abigail had suddenly withdrawn. If she was now approximately 12 weeks pregnant, the timing aligned perfectly with their relationship. There had been no someone else before him in the time frame that would make her statement true. The realization hit him with startling clarity. Abigail was lying. The question was why. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The screen displayed his lawyer's name. "James," Mason answered, "it's late for you to be calling about business." "This isn't entirely business," James replied. "Though it does concern Victoria. I received a rather unusual call from her lawyer today, hinting that she might contest certain aspects of your divorce settlement unless some additional considerations are made." Mason frowned. "What kind of considerations?" "That's the interesting part. Rather than specific assets, she's floating the idea of a non-disclosure agreement. Something about protecting both your reputations from potentially embarrassing revelations. Blackmail, in other words," Mason said flatly. "Essentially, yes. I declined on your behalf, of course, but I thought you should know. Has something happened that might give Victoria leverage?" Mason's mind raced to Victoria's appearance at his office and her confrontation with Abigail. "Possibly. I need to look into something. Thanks for the heads up, James." After ending the call, Mason sat in contemplative silence. Victoria's attempted blackmail, Abigail's lie about the baby's paternity, her sudden withdrawal from their relationship. The pieces were beginning to form a disturbing picture. The next morning, determined to uncover the truth, Mason arrived at the office at 7, knowing that Abigail often came in early to get ahead on her work. He found her alone in the break room, preparing tea instead of her usual coffee. Another small change he noted as evidence of her pregnancy. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Abigail nearly dropped her mug, startled by his sudden appearance. "Mr. Reed, I was just about to review the Johnson account. This isn't about work, and you know it." Mason closed the break room door, ensuring their privacy. "I've been doing some calculations, Abigail. The timing of your pregnancy coincides exactly with our relationship. There was no someone else before me, was there?" Color rose in Abigail's cheeks, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "My personal life is none of your business." "It is when it involves my child," Mason countered, stepping closer. "I want the truth, Abigail. No more evasions." Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You don't understand what you're asking." "Then help me understand," he said, softening his tone. "Because right now all I see is that you're carrying my child, and for some reason you're determined to keep me in the dark about it. What are you afraid of? Is it Victoria? Did she threaten you?" The mention of Victoria's name caused Abigail to pale visibly. "Please, just let this go," she whispered. "I can't," Mason said simply. "Not when it's my child. Not when it's you." The raw honesty in his voice seemed to break something in Abigail. She sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "She came to my apartment," she admitted quietly. "Victoria. She knew about the pregnancy somehow, said one of the cleaning staff had overheard me talking about morning sickness and told her cousin who works for Victoria." Mason took the seat across from her, his full attention on every word. "What did she say to you?" "She said she still had influence with the board, that she could make sure I lost my job if I tried to trap you with a baby." Abigail's voice trembled with the memory. "She talked about how a scandal would affect your reputation, how a child would hold you back from what you really wanted, and then she mentioned my mother's medical care." "Your mother's Parkinson's treatment," Mason said, the final piece clicking into place. "Victoria threatened your mother's health care?" Abigail nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Without my job and the insurance it provides, I can't afford Mom's treatments. Victoria made it very clear that if I acknowledged you as the father, she would make sure I was fired. She has friends on the board who would believe whatever she told them about me." Anger surged through Mason, at Victoria for her cruelty, at himself for not seeing what was happening sooner. "So you pushed me away and denied the baby was mine to protect your mother?" "What choice did I have?" Abigail asked, her voice breaking. "Mom has sacrificed everything for me my whole life. I couldn't let her suffer because of my choices." Mason reached across the table and took her hand. "You had another choice, Abigail. You could have trusted me." "I barely know you," she countered, though she didn't pull her hand away. "A few weeks of dinners and conversations doesn't mean you would stand by me against your ex-wife and potential scandal. Men with far less to lose have walked away from responsibilities like this." "Like your father," Mason said quietly, understanding dawning. "He left when you were young, didn't he?" Abigail nodded, surprised by his insight. "How did you know?" "It's in your file. Only your mother listed as family, and something in the way you look at me sometimes, like you're waiting for me to disappoint you." Mason squeezed her hand gently. "But I'm not your father, Abigail, and I'm not the man Victoria thinks I am either. This baby, our baby, isn't a trap or a burden. It's a gift I never thought I'd have." The conviction in his voice seemed to reach something deep within Abigail, and for the first time since Victoria's visit, she allowed herself to hope. But then reality reasserted itself, and she withdrew her hand. "It doesn't change the situation," she said sadly. "Victoria can still hurt my mother through me." Mason's expression hardened with determination. "Not if I have anything to say about it. Victoria might think she still has power over me, over us, but she's about to learn otherwise." Monday morning arrived with a tension that seemed to permeate the entire 30th floor of Horizon Enterprises. Rumors had spread through the office grapevine about Mason Reed requesting an emergency board meeting, a rare occurrence that typically signaled major company decisions or crises. Speculation ranged from potential acquisitions to restructuring, but the true purpose remained known only to Mason and his closest advisors. Abigail sat at her desk, attempting to focus on spreadsheets while her mind raced with anxiety. After their conversation in the break room, Mason had assured her he had a plan to neutralize Victoria's threats, but he'd been frustratingly vague about the details. "The less you know right now, the better," he'd said, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "Trust me, Abigail, just this once. Let someone else fight for you." Those words had resonated deeply, touching a part of her that had spent years being the strong one, the provider, the protector. The idea of someone fighting her battles felt both foreign and frighteningly appealing. At precisely 10 o'clock, Mason's assistant Kate approached Abigail's cubicle. "Miss Parker, Mr. Reed requests your presence in the main boardroom." Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. "The board meeting, but I'm not—" "He was very specific," Kate said, her expression revealing nothing. "You're expected immediately." The walk to the boardroom felt like the longest journey of Abigail's life. Each step brought her closer to a confrontation she'd been dreading, since Victoria's threats had forced her into denying her baby's paternity. What was Mason planning? Would it protect her mother, or make everything worse? When she entered, 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her. The entire board of directors sat around the massive oak table, with Mason at the head. Victoria, surprisingly, occupied a chair to his right, her expression a careful mask of professional interest that didn't quite hide her displeasure at Abigail's arrival. "Miss Parker, thank you for joining us," Mason said formally, gesturing to an empty seat across from Victoria. "Please sit down." Abigail took the offered chair, folding her trembling hands in her lap. The weight of the moment pressed down on her as Mason stood, commanding the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, thank you for accommodating this emergency meeting," he began, his voice steady and authoritative. "I've called you here to address several issues that affect both the company's future and my own personal life. Two spheres that have recently become unexpectedly intertwined." Victoria shifted in her seat, a flicker of unease crossing her features. "Mason, perhaps some matters should remain private. Privacy has its place," Mason interrupted smoothly, "but so does transparency, especially when threats and coercion enter the equation." He turned his gaze directly to Victoria. "Isn't that right, Victoria?" The board members exchanged puzzled glances as Victoria's composure slipped momentarily. "I don't know what you're implying," she said coolly. "Then allow me to be clear." Mason pressed a button on the remote in his hand, and the large screen behind him illuminated with an image of a legal document. This is a copy of our final divorce agreement, which includes a non-interference clause that prohibits either party from interfering with the other's business relationships or personal affairs, a clause that you've violated repeatedly in recent weeks. Victoria's face hardened. That's a serious accusation. One I can substantiate, Mason replied, advancing to the next slide, a series of text messages. These are communications between your assistant and Diane Martinez, a member of our cleaning staff and apparently your cousin's friend. They detail your instruction to gather information about Ms. Parker's private life and medical condition. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the board members, Victoria's cheeks flushed with anger. You had no right to access those messages. I had every right when they involved conspiracy against a Horizon employee, Mason countered. Ms. Martinez has provided a signed affidavit confirming she was paid to spy on Ms. Parker and report back to you. Corporate espionage is grounds for immediate termination, which has already been processed. Abigail watched the exchange with growing amazement, scarcely able to believe Mason had gone to such lengths to uncover Victoria's machinations. But why target Ms. Parker specifically? Asked Richard Donovan, the eldest board member. What's the connection? Mason's gaze softened as it found Abigail's. Miss Parker and I were briefly involved following my divorce. That relationship ended abruptly after Victoria discovered Miss Parker was pregnant and threatened to use her connections on this board to have her terminated if she didn't deny I was the father. The boardroom erupted in exclamations and questions. Through the chaos, Abigail locked eyes with Mason, finding strength in his unwavering support. That's preposterous, Victoria snapped, her composure fully fracturing. She told me herself the baby wasn't yours. After you threatened her mother's health care, Mason replied evenly. You found her vulnerability and exploited it, knowing that without her job and its benefits, her mother's Parkinson's treatments would become unaffordable. The revelation silenced the room. Even Victoria seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Is this true, Ms. Parker? Asked Joanne Wheeler, the board's only female member. Abigail took a deep breath, drawing courage from Mason's steady presence. Yes, she admitted, her voice stronger than she expected. Victoria came to my apartment and made it clear that if I acknowledged Mr. Reed as the father of my child, she would ensure I lost my position here. My mother's health depends on the insurance this job provides. I felt I had no choice. There's always a choice, Victoria said dismissively, recovering her poise. You could have chosen not to sleep with my husband. Ex-husband, Mason corrected sharply. And our relationship began weeks after our divorce was finalized. The dates are clearly documented. He advanced to the next slide, displaying a medical document. This is a redacted copy of Ms. Parker's ultrasound report from last week, showing a pregnancy of 12 weeks and 5 days at that time. The conception date aligns perfectly with our relationship, confirming beyond doubt that this child is mine. Victoria's eyes narrowed dangerously. So what now, Mason? You've made your point. What do you want? First, a formal acknowledgement from this board that any attempt to terminate Miss Parker's employment, based on her personal relationship with me or her pregnancy, would constitute discrimination and will not be tolerated. Mason looked at each board member in turn, receiving nods of agreement. Second, I'm invoking the non-interference clause of our divorce agreement. Any further attempts to meddle in my personal or professional life will result in legal action. Richard Donovan cleared his throat. Speaking for the board, we had no knowledge of these activities, and we certainly do not condone them. Ms. Parker's position is secure, regardless of her personal relationship with you, Mason. Thank you, Richard, Mason said, then turned to address Victoria directly. You once accused me of being distracted by ambition, of not wanting a family. You were wrong. What I didn't want was a marriage where career and appearances mattered more than love and trust. Victoria stood abruptly, gathering her designer handbag. This is all very theatrical, Mason. Congratulations on your performance. The board seems suitably impressed. She glanced coldly at Abigail. As for you, dear, enjoy it while it lasts. Men like Mason don't stay enchanted with simple girls for long. With that parting shot, Victoria strode from the boardroom, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The meeting concluded shortly afterward, with board members filing out with varied expressions of shock, sympathy, and in some cases, poorly concealed interest in the unfolding drama. Eventually, only Mason and Abigail remained in the vast room. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, moving to sit beside her. Abigail nodded, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I can't believe you did all that. The investigation, the evidence. You must have been working on it all weekend." "I would have worked longer if necessary," Mason said simply. "No one threatens the people I care about." "People you care about," Abigail repeated softly. "Is that what I am?" Mason took her hands in his expression serious. "You're much more than that, Abigail. These past months without you have been empty. I told myself it was just the aftermath of the divorce, but the truth is I missed you. Not just the relationship, but your kindness, your integrity, your strength." Finding out about the baby was a shock, but also what? She prompted when he hesitated. "A gift," he finished. "A chance for the family I've always wanted, with a woman I was already falling in love with." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. "You can't just say things like that," she whispered. "Why not? It's the truth." Mason reached out to gently wipe away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I'm not asking for promises, Abigail. I know we have a lot to figure out, but I want to be part of this baby's life, and yours if you'll let me." "What about the company? The gossip, the complications?" "Let me worry about that," Mason said firmly. "All I need to know is if there's a chance for us. A real chance, without threats or fears standing in the way." Abigail considered his words, thinking of all they'd been through, and the unexpected path that had led them here. She thought of her mother, who had always told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it for something worthwhile. "Yes," she said finally, a smile breaking through her tears. "There's definitely a chance." 6 months later, Eleanor Parker sat in a comfortable chair in Mason and Abigail's new home, watching as they prepared the nursery for their son's imminent arrival. The past months had brought many changes: a promotion for Abigail to head of financial analysis, a healthcare specialist for Eleanor, who was responding well to an innovative treatment program, and a small spring wedding that had made headlines not for scandal, but for its genuine warmth. "You were right, Mom," Abigail said, joining her mother while Mason assembled the crib. "Not all men are like Dad. Some of them stay and fight for what matters." Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand, her eyes bright with happiness. "Sometimes the best journeys take us through the darkest valleys before we find our way home." As Mason looked up and smiled at the two women who had become his family, Abigail knew they had indeed found their way home, to a place built not on fear or obligation, but on truth, courage, and love that had survived its first test and emerged stronger for it.